All right, I think we can go ahead and get started. Welcome, everybody. My name is Jeff McDonald, and on behalf of the Global Institute for Water Security and the Global Water Futures program that are underwriting this series, I'd like to welcome you to this, our final lecture of the fall term. Remember to type your questions into the chat. That can be happening throughout the talk, and I'll be asking those questions at the end of the talk. And before we get started, we want to acknowledge that we are on Treaty 6 territory and homeland of the Métis. We pay our respect to the First Nations and Métis ancestors of this place and reaffirm our relationship with one another. And it's a real pleasure to introduce a friend and colleague, Genevieve Ali, who's an associate professor in the School of Environmental Sciences at the University of Guelph. Genevieve did her PhD and earlier degrees in physical geography at the University of Montreal and was a professor at Manitoba before shifting to Guelph, I think almost 2 years ago now. She started off as an assistant professor and junior chair at the Department of Geological Sciences at University of Manitoba, and her chair was in Manitoba's Watershed Systems Research Program. I had the pleasure of working with Genevieve during a postdoc stint she had at the University of Aberdeen in the UK, but since then she's just gone on to great strides and has made some quite significant contributions in the area of water, sediment, and nutrient connectivity, among other things. This has been recognized with several awards. She won a Young Scientist Award from the Canadian Geophysical Union and was Early Career Researcher Award through NSERC. And she's now a real thought leader in our field, an associate editor for Soil Science Society of America journal and HES, a journal that many of us publish in. She's on the editorial board of Scientific Reports, a nature journal. And what I've really appreciated is her leadership within AGU, where she's currently deputy chair of the AGU Catchment Hydrology Technical Committee. So, Genevieve, thanks so much for being with us today. And without further ado, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you so much. So, hi, everyone. Thanks for having me, and thanks a lot to Jeff for the introduction and for the invitation as well. And so what I really want to discuss today is the concept of connectivity. So connectivity is a word that keeps coming up over and over again in discussions, not only in a research context, but also in a policy-related context. And sometimes we do mean the same thing when we use that term, but sometimes we do not. And so what I want to do today is to explore very quickly some of our, terminology-related challenges. And then I want to use those as a segue to discuss research questions that I think could form the basis of a future research agenda on the topic. And I'll be happy to hear what you think about those questions as well. So first off, what is connectivity? I think that some of our difficulty with that term comes from the fact that it is both an everyday word and a scientific concept. So anybody you talk to would be able to tell you that they've heard the word connectivity before to refer to their internet, their friends on social media, their brain neurons, and whatever else. So at a very high level, connectivity is defined as the probability that a location A will be able to transmit something, quote unquote, to a location B. And some people also refer to connectivity as the degree to which a system will allow or will facilitate the movement of material or information within its different components. And then when we focus on hydrologic connectivity or ecohydrological connectivity specifically, then we're targeting the unimpeded water-mediated transfer of matter, energy, and organisms. So there are different qualifiers that can be juxtaposed to the word connectivity, and then the hydrologic qualifier is only one of them. So the phrase landscape connectivity that you can see here is definitely a popular one because connectivity can take place along different dimensions. So upland, lowland, upstream, downstream, or surface, subsurface. Then you also have the phrases lateral, longitudinal, or vertical connectivity that exists. And then when we want to focus on different types of materials that are moving across the landscape, then we can use phrases like sedimentological connectivity, chemical connectivity, biological connectivity, or just material connectivity. I guess another way to look at the different facets of connectivity is to look at pathways first, and then active versus passive movement second. And so as you can see here, some people focus mainly on alien transport, which is not my case, while others look at water transport, which I'm guessing most of you do like me. So water connectivity can then be expressed differently depending on the depth of the flow path that's being considered. So overland versus shallow subsurface versus deep surface. And then those flow paths can then allow the water-mediated connectivity of sediment, chemical elements, or biota. And we consider those types of materials separately because some of them can move passively. So you could think of water, sediment, solutes, or plant seeds. But then you have others that move actively. So you could think of frogs or salmon or ducks in the context of biota, for example. There are many reasons behind the buzz around connectivity, and some of those reasons are research related, while others are policy related. On the research side, I would say that the concept of connectivity is key, notably because it can help us make some sense of nonlinear hydrological behavior. And so hydrosystems like this, where we have a linear relationship between hydrological inputs and outputs, systems like this are quite rare. What we're rather dealing with are relationships like these, where there is no flow or barely any flow, until a critical value of precipitation or soil moisture is exceeded. And then once it has been exceeded, then flow is generated, and that's what I highlighted in blue here. And so there are a few different shapes of nonlinear hydrological behavior that have been documented in the literature. And I would say that the jury is still out as to why that is the case. But regardless, the moment when the threshold is exceeded is often believed to be I guess, an indication of when the landscape is, quote unquote, well connected. When it comes to watershed management or policymaking, the concept of connectivity is also meant to be interpreted in a very practical way. It does not necessarily mean that it is practical right now, but it is meant to be so, or at least we hope it can be. And so say we have a landscape like this with water quality issues at the downstream end, then the challenge becomes to identify which sources of pollutants are indeed connected to the watershed outlet so that we can target those sources for potential remediation or mitigation. So in principle, connectivity is seen as a tool that can help us answer the question, what should we do where in terms of management? So connectivity is important, but the big question is, how do we measure it and how do we model it? And that is where things become a little bit tricky because there's no consensus on how to do this. Measurement approaches tend to be definition driven. And so the multiplicity of definitions kind of leads to a pick and choose philosophy when it comes to measurement. Having multiple definitions is evidence of the diversity of ideas that exist in the field, which is great, but it does make it near impossible to carry a steady intercomparisons. And so here you only have, I guess, a small sample of connectivity definitions that are available in the literature, and I just want to highlight a few of those. So some hydrologic connectivity definitions focus on physiographic variables that represent the architecture or the structure of the landscape. And so those definitions refer to structural hydrologic connectivity, so the potential for hydrologic connectivity to occur based on physiography. Otherwise, you have other connectivity definitions that rather rely on actual water-related variables, and that makes them focus on the more functional or the more effective aspects of connectivity. Now, one hydrologic connectivity definition that has been quite popular in the recent literature is the one that I highlighted in red here. And in that definition, the focus is on the existence and the spatial continuity of subsurface flow along the hill slope riparian stream continuum. And that's a definition that I've used a lot myself to set up new experimental sites, not only in quasi-pristine environments, but also in heavily human impacted environments. And so case in point, here you have 3 examples of riparian to stream transects that we set up in an agroforested watershed in Manitoba several years ago. So we had shallow water table wells in the riparian area and a stilling well in the adjacent stream, all equipped with water level loggers. And the animated diagrams that you see here are just a schematic way of visualizing the water level time series. And so we use those time series to assess the presence absence of subsurface flow driven connectivity along the riparian stream continuum. And so here I'm going to show you the results of that assessment for just one transect and 1 year. So the blue line, I need to look for my pointer here. There it is. So the blue line that you can see in the upper panel corresponds to the stream water level, which is expressed in meters above sea level. And then what you have in the bottom panel is a bar chart that shows the outcome of our connectivity assessment. So the bars in the cold colors show instances of subsurface flow connectivity from the riparian area to the stream. And you have different shades of blue simply to reflect the different distances over which we observe the lateral hydraulic gradient in the riparian to stream zone, I guess. And then the bars in the warm colors rather show instances of subsurface flow reversal, so flow from the stream towards the riparian area. So this was just an example for one transect and 1 year here. And of course, we can make an assessment like that across several transects and then compare the dynamics observed across them. So this is what you have here. The x-axis is the time axis that spans 1 year. And then you have 6 transects that are listed along the y-axis. And then within the graphing area, you have something that resembles a barcode. So white space means that no flow was observed. A black line signifies the presence of connectivity. And then a gray line signals the presence of a flow reversal. So really, long story short, the subsurface flow-driven definition of connectivity that I showed you before is one that can be tied to a relatively simple experimental setup. And it is also a definition that can be used to quantify the presence-absence of subsurface water movement along a hill slope riparian stream continuum per se. There is another hydrologic connectivity definition that has been quite popular as well in some parts of the literature, and that's the one that's highlighted in red here. So that definition relies on spatial patterns of soil moisture or water table data in an attempt to collect temporal snapshots of where water actually is in the landscape. And this is, again, a definition that I've used quite a lot myself. One recent example of that would be a study that we conducted across the whole Lake Winnipeg watershed a couple of years ago. So we took 160-something satellite-derived soil moisture maps spanning 7 years. And so those were our 165, I think, temporal snapshots. And those are the ones that you can see in the upper panel on this slide. And then we decided to classify every single pixel in those maps as either hydrologically inactive, hydrologically active, or hydrologically connected to streams and lakes. And so the results of that analysis are partly represented in the lower panel on this slide. So the pixels that appear in blue were classified as being hydrologically connected to a stream or a lake on a particular date. And the patterns that you see here kind of align with the definition that I showed you a few seconds ago, and that referred to, I had to copy paste it here, referred to hydrologically relevant spatial patterns of properties that facilitate flow and transport in a hydrologic system. So there are dozens of examples of studies like these in the literature. They're not unique. And these examples rely on one hydrologic connectivity definition or another, and they also use one measurement approach or another. And for me, seeing all those highly different examples really begs the question of whether a concept that is as intuitive as connectivity should be easy to measure and or easy to model. And the connectivity concept is intuitive, that's true, but it's also multifaceted, and therefore it's quite complicated. So we know that the driving factors of connectivity are quite different across regions, they're different across spatial scales and temporal scales as well. And we also know that some connections can be quite difficult to detect, either because they're transient or because they tend to occur in the subsurface. And modeling hydrologic connectivity in an explicit manner is also not something that our current hydrological models are doing very well, even when they're fully distributed models. And so here, the diagram that you see on the screen comes from a paper that was published in 2017. and which reviewed some hydrological models with the goal of simulating wetland to wetland connectivity and wetland to stream connectivity as well. And in this paper that was led by Heather Golden, we were able to classify existing models into two main categories. So in this figure, in the models that are highlighted in red, the potential for hydrologic connectivity to occur is defined a priori based on physiographic information. And so basically what that means is that the models assume that macro scale landscape structure is the main determinant of hydrologic connectivity, which is something that we know not to be universally true. Now, conversely to that, the models that are highlighted in blue do not define connections a priori. They rather use process laws to simulate functional aspects of connectivity, which is presumably better. But even with that, most models do have a hard time simulating emergent behaviors, including the models that are color-coded in blue here. And so for those of you who may not be too familiar with complex system science, the word emergent is typically used to refer to dynamics that arise from the interaction between system components and their environments. And so those dynamics cannot be simply inferred from adding system components together or adding system interactions together. And that is why emergent dynamics can be pretty difficult to predict using traditional equation-based models. And regardless of whether you look at the ecology literature or the hydrology literature, connectivity is often referred to as an emergent property that arises from local landscape water interactions. Now, if you like lamenting in groups rather than alone, one element that might be a little bit encouraging is the fact that hydrologists are not the only ones who are struggling with how to understand, measure, and model connectivity and emergent behaviors. And so the table that you have here is a table that I modified after something that was published by Laura Turnbull and colleagues in 2018. And you can see that the degree of progress that has been made in recent years varies quite a lot across disciplines. So hydrologists and geomorphologists have made progress with respect to figuring out how to measure connectivity, but measuring approaches still present a challenge for us. And understanding emergent behaviors still appears to be out of reach in the sense that it still presents a major challenge for the discipline. And this is contrary to the level of comfort that computational neuroscientists seem to have achieved. So for them, devising measures of brain connectivity and understanding emergent behaviors does not seem to present a challenge. And that may be an indication that we should maybe read their literature a little bit more and see what we may be able to borrow from them. Now, when it comes to hydrology and ecohydrology specifically, though, what I want to do today is to underline some open questions that could help shape future research on connectivity. So basically questions that could potentially help us move beyond site-specific or definition-specific connectivity studies. So we'll focus on 6 of those questions today. And of course, this list of 6 is not an exhaustive one. That said, I think that looking at those 6 questions could be a starting point to improve our collective knowledge of connectivity across a large continuum of landscapes. So first question first, to me, one of the first and most important questions that we need to answer is whether it is possible to devise one universal or quasi-universal definition of ecohydrological connectivity. So a definition that would be applicable to several types of materials and therefore would be relevant to several disciplines. And so we think so, and here by we, I mean Chris Spence, Claire Oswald, Chris Whelan, and I, and you can see the pictures of Chris, and Claire here. And some of our thoughts on that topic are summarized in this WRR paper, review paper, that was published in 2018, and in which we describe the framework that we call TTEL, the TTEL method. So the TTEL acronym stands for timescales, thresholds, excesses, and losses. Long story short, the concept of connectivity has been identified as a useful organizing principle, not only in ecology, where it's heavily present, but also in hydrology. And so in accordance with that, ecologists have produced some high-level how-to guides for measuring and modeling connectivity. Hydrologists do not have anything similar though, so no how-to guides. And so this is a gap that we wanted to try to partially fill with that particular paper. And then if my recollection is correct, I think we had 3 main objectives in that paper. So one was to identify a definition of connectivity that can be operationalized, and I'll explain what I mean by that in the next few seconds. Objective number 2 was to suggest a conceptual framework for assessing water and material connectivity simultaneously. And here by material, I mean sediment and solutes. And then objective number 3 was to put forward a bunch of generic equations just as a way to translate our conceptual framework into a mathematical one. So when we did a review of the connectivity-related literature in hydrology, hydrogeology, geomorphology, ecology, neuroscience as well, we realized that there were almost as many connectivity definitions as there are papers out there. And we really wanted a definition that would pass what we call the operational test. So a definition that would be explicit enough so that it could be translated into quantitative measures of connectivity. So we found a definition in ecology that almost fit that bill, and so we modified it a little bit for ecohydrological applications. And that is what you have here. So basically, if we consider a source location A and a receiving location B, then connectivity will occur between A and B only if the magnitude of the water and the material that is leaving A is larger than all the losses that will actually occur during the travel from A to B. So it is a definition that is relatively simple and intuitive. It is quasi-universal because it works with water and material, and also because it's not restricted to a single flow process. So for example, it's not applicable to subsurface flow driven connectivity only. It's also spatially explicit, and it points us directly to the variables that we need to measure. So we need to measure the amount of water or material that's mobilized at point A, and then we need to quantify all or most of the losses that occur along the flow path or the flow paths from A to B. So after that, we built a high-level conceptual model of conditions that need to be met before connectivity is established. And here I really want to stress that we did not reinvent the wheel. We simply synthesized what was out there in the literature up to 2017 or so. So when we consider water connectivity, for example, there are multiple mechanisms via which water can be mobilized at point A. So those mechanisms could include Ortonian volume flow, saturation excess of volume flow, shallow subsurface flow, etc. And we did not want an approach that was process specific or flow path specific though. We really wanted to focus on elements that are common to most, if not all runoff processes, in a way a bit similar to what Jeff McDonald did in a 2013 commentary when he asked whether all runoff processes are the same. And so we decided that what was really important for us, regardless of the dominant flow process, was to quantify a hydrologic excess or H excess at point A. And so that excess might be infiltration driven or storage driven, but regardless, it is an excess of water that can leave our source point A, and we would like to be able to quantify it. Now, for the water travel from A to B, we wanted to account for water losses that may occur via evapotranspiration, infiltration, depression, storage, etc. So we highlighted 2 variables of importance. One of them is simply the actual distance traveled. And then the second one, HA, is the cumulative hydrologic abstractions along the flow path or the flow paths per se. Regarding water-mediated material connectivity, we know that the mobilization of material at the source point, so A, depends on the degree to which the stocks of materials intersect with active water flow pathways. And so we simply identify the mass of material available to be mobilized as being a key variable to measure. The material traveling from A to B was a little bit trickier, I guess, in the sense that it is affected by many different losses and transformations. So those losses can take the form of sediment accumulation in landscape depressions, or nutrient absorptions in soil, or gentrification, etc. So for the travel from A to B, we heavily relied on a set of papers by Caroline Holdham, published in 2013, before deciding to focus on two key variables. So one of those variables, dA, is the down column number, dimensionless, and it gives us an estimate of the degree of conversion of material along the flow path from A to B. So that was one key variable. And then the other one was Ca, which is simply the mass of material that is lost due to hydrologic abstractions during travel per se. And so once we identified our key variables, we put forward a set of generic equations that incorporate those variables. And so that's what you have here. And some of the key variables are highlighted in blue. And I'm not going to go through the details of these equations. I just want to highlight a few things. And so here in this table, you can see in the rows that we have a bunch of connectivity properties. So the occurrence of it, which is quantified in terms of presence absence, but also the frequency, duration, and magnitude of it. And we actually devised two sets of equations that are listed in the table. And so we have equations that quantify connectivity properties for a single pair of A to B points, but we can also integrate those equations over space so that we can quantify connectivity across a whole land unit, so a whole hill slope or a whole watershed. And so this diagram here shows the single A to B pair scenario, while this one here shows how we can take the occurrence of connectivity, integrate it across all I to B pairs in order to get an estimate of contributing area, which is basically an estimate of the spatial extent of connectivity. We use a similar approach for the equations that are associated with water-mediated material connectivity, as you can see here. And without going into the details, I will just say that we're still proposing equations for a single pair of A to B points and then for multiple pairs of points. And you may be wondering why we're insisting on quantifying multiple properties of connectivity, so the occurrence, spatial extent, frequency, duration, etc. And that is because we think that it may help us resolve some equifinality issues. So there are conditions that could lead to the occurrence of water connectivity with similar magnitude in terms of volume of water moved, for example, but those similar conditions could be associated with very different properties in terms of spatial extent and duration. And we thought that in order to make a comprehensive assessment of connectivity and its drivers, that we needed to actually be able to differentiate those conditions. And so going back to my first question, the one in which I identified the search for a quasi-universal connectivity definition or quantification approach, I think that this is a key milestone that we should aim for. Now, the T-TAL method is one example of what it could look like, but it is not a perfect solution by any means. And one of the main drawbacks associated with the T-TAL method is that it is quite data hungry. And so I consider that first question as one that is still open, and I'm kind of hoping that there will be more synthesis efforts in the future to try to address it. Now, the second question that I think we should put on the agenda is about whether or not we can use connectivity measures to classify catchments and to validate hydrological models. So on one end, we know that both ecologists and hydrologists are very keen on catchment and landscape classification. And to support our classification efforts, we're all searching for key metrics that can capture or that encapsulate several key functional aspects of a catchment or a landscape at the same time. And theoretically, connectivity fits that bill. But that being said, moving beyond the theory would mean that we need to identify what the best connectivity metric or metrics would actually be for classifying ecohydrological systems, and that's something that we haven't done yet. And then it would also be quite neat if we were able to reach a consensus on one or several connectivity metrics that we could then use to reduce modeling uncertainty. So we all know that models are imperfect tools, and most of the time in hydrology, we try to quote unquote reduce their uncertainty by comparing model flow data to observed flow data. The problem is that different connectivity patterns might actually lead to the same flow values and vice versa. And so then that would create situations where models can give us the right answers, so the right quote unquote flow values, but for the wrong reasons because connectivity is not well represented internally by those models. And so one way to address that could be to take a hydrological model, any model really, run it multiple times. Actually, I shouldn't have said any model. A fully distributed model would be best. And so take a model, run it multiple times to identify the range of connectivity patterns that it can represent. And so that range would be represented in green here. And then we would compare those model results to connectivity patterns that have been observed in the field, typically on sporadic equations, but those would be your red patches there. And so the areas where the green and the red patches overlap would be the least uncertain model outputs, because they would be constrained by both flow data and some connectivity information that would be available. Now, there are papers and research groups around the world that have touched on incorporating explicit connectivity information into the modeling process, but they've mostly done so by using topographically driven connectivity metrics. And since we know that topographically driven connectivity metrics are not universally applicable, there's definitely room to grow, which is why I listed that topic as an important line of inquiry for a connectivity research agenda. The third question that I included on my draft research agenda here is one regarding the possibility of testing hypothesis about connectivity as an emergent feature. So earlier I told you that traditional equation-based models often have trouble simulating emergent dynamics. There are, however, complex system models that are designed to do specifically that, even when limited data are available. Some of those models are quite popular in ecology and other disciplines, but they're not commonly used in hydrology yet, especially not in connectivity studies. And so there may be opportunities to use them to conduct thought experiments. So just to test hypotheses about how water connectivity may emerge in a variety of landscapes. So that's something that we're looking at a bit in my group. And just to illustrate what we're trying to do, I'm going to show you model animations for 2 virtual experiments that we set up for a wetland-dominated landscape. And so one of the experiments is set up within the framework of an agent-based model, and the other one is set up within the framework of a cellular automated model. And so both model types are rooted in complex systems theory, but they rely on different hypotheses for connectivity dynamics to emerge. And we really wanted to see whether any of the 2 models or both models would be able to simulate the coalescing of wetlands or the merging of previously isolated flow paths. And we wanted to test that knowing that within the models, there's no deterministic factor that would actually force those merging dynamics to occur. And so if we see them, then that would mean that they're the result of emergence from local scale landscape water interactions, because those local scale landscape water interactions are actually coded in the models. So here, I didn't say that before, the cellular automated model is on the left, the agent-based model is on the right. And for the example that I'm going to show here, we applied both models to exactly the same landscape, and both models were forced with exactly the same weather data. And then as I go through the 90-day simulation, on the left, at one point, you will start seeing wetlands that are coalescing with one another, which will be when you have blue patches that are merging with one another on the left. On the right, the dynamics are different. What you will see are ribbon-like features that emerge or start to appear when conditions become increasingly wet. And those ribbon-like features actually correspond to water flow paths that are active in the landscape. Now, since the 2 models rely on vastly different hypotheses, we can only compare them to a limited extent. So in terms of timing of key events, like timing of merging of wetlands, or timing of maximum extent of hydrologically active areas, etc. And those differences of timing are interesting because they can tell us how quickly or slowly we might expect connectivity to emerge in different scenarios. Now, there's one big thing that we haven't been able to do with those models, though, and it is to calibrate or validate them using field data or remotely sensed data. So that's something that we're currently working on. Virtual experiments are interesting learning exercises, of course, but they don't have any predictive value. And so what we really want to do ultimately is to use those models or to test those models in a predictive sense and to see which one or which ones may better reflect the macro scale hydrologic patterns that we see in the field. Ecologists have been able to use these models quite successfully to advance their knowledge of connectivity. So I'm kind of hoping that hydrologists can put them on their agenda too and try them out. The fourth question that I listed here is about how hierarchical landscape organization is driving hydrologic connectivity. And what I want to underline here is that in all landscapes, although we may have hundreds of runoff producing areas or thousands of runoff producing areas, they're not all made equal. And in fact, they all exist within a spatial hierarchy. And so typically when we look at upstream downstream gradients, we tend to focus on the whole contributing area, which is my red polygon here. And we basically, as we start downstream or downslope towards the upslope, we're interested in seeing how far upslope it actually extends. What we do have to remember though, is that within that contributing area, we do have a range of hydrologically active areas that are interconnected. So those active areas are all part of a network, and their relative position within the network will actually give them a different role or a different influence. So in the diagram that I have here, the blue-colored active areas can be seen as ordinary nodes in the network in the sense that they do not have a disproportionate influence on the overall structure or the overall robustness of the network. However, the green colored active areas have a more critical role because when they become inactive, so when they turn red, they do have the ability of disconnecting large numbers of source areas from downstream. And so in doing so, they act as switches or connectivity gatekeepers. And knowing where gatekeepers are can be quite valuable in a management context. And the reason why that is since the location of gatekeepers gives them a greater than normal influence on the network, it is reasonable to think that implementing mitigation measures where they're located may also give us greater than normal returns on our investment. And we can identify those gatekeeper locations quite well by relying on network theory or graph theory. And so I'm just going to give you a quick example of how we can do that. And I'm going to focus on a small region of Southern Ontario, just north of Lake Erie for that. So for that particular study or project, our goal was to, to identify fallow agricultural lands that could be used to manage excess surface water after big rainfall events. And so in order to pick which fallow lands might act as gatekeepers, we use graph theory and network metrics. We actually ran the analysis over a whole 7,000 square kilometer watershed, but I'm just going to zoom in on a small portion of that watershed so that you can see the details. So very quick rundown of our methodological steps. So we mapped our fallow land patches. So those are the ones that you can see in yellow there. And then we assigned them to be the nodes of our network. So first step. Then we also identified surface water flow paths in our region. And then when a flow path, and those are the black grayish lines that you can see. And then when a flow path was present between two nodes, then we converted that flow path into a network link. And so that is how we came up with our network. And then once our network was established, we computed a bunch of network metrics, including network centrality measures for every single node. And the gatekeepers were simply identified as the nodes that have the highest network centrality values. So on the map here, out of all the red nodes, the blue circles are the ones that are identified as gatekeepers. So knowing more about the hierarchical importance of different landscape locations could not only improve our process understanding in terms of the spatial extent or deployment of connectivity, but also guide management initiatives. And so that's the reason why I identified that topic for a potential research agenda. What I did not tell you, though, is that this step here is really the make or break one in the sense that the identification of gatekeepers is highly sensitive to the data that is used to identify actual flow paths or likely flow paths. And so this is yet another example where we may have a promising numerical tool to address a connectivity related question, but we're again hitting a roadblock when it comes to figuring out the best combination of data to use to actually feed that tool. And so this recurrent data issue kind of leads me to the fifth question on my agenda here, which is a question that is not really covered in the literature to date. So what are the minimum data requirements for hydrology connectivity study? If I were to rephrase that question, I would say that we need to examine the extent to which our ability to detect connectivity depends on scale-related issues. And you can even flip that sentence and say that we need to examine whether our failure to detect connectivity in some instances actually depends on similar scale-related issues. And so regardless of the connectivity definition that you rely on, the focus is almost always going to be on runoff producing areas in the landscape, so hydrologically active areas, and then the goal will be to assess the presence of a spatial relationship between them. And hydrologists have been devising ways of identifying active areas at experimental sites for decades, using both time series data and spatial pattern data. So that's not where the issue lies. The issue is rather that data availability is quite different depending on the scales that we decide to focus on. So most of the connectivity studies published in the literature have focused on plot scales, experimental hill slopes, and small experimental catchments. And for those sites, we do often have long, high-frequency time series data, and we often have as well high-resolution maps of hydrologically active areas. That is not the case for larger study regions. So for large regions, we can sometimes have long time series data, but with time steps that are much coarser. And the spatial resolution of maps, any maps really, is also much coarser when considering large study regions. And that is problematic since we know that it is at those larger scales that a lot of human activities and infrastructure are likely to affect the natural connectivity structure of the landscape. And so if you want to target accessible data over large regions, the best candidate data sets are certainly going to be remotely sensed data sets as opposed to ground-based data sets. And some of the data sets that we're working with in my group include SMUS data, Landsat, MODIS, RadarSat-2 a little bit, and hopefully soon RadarSat Constellation as well if we get permission to actually access it. To date, we've always decided to go with one data set or another purely based on opportunity. So what that means is that we haven't really devised criteria, and no criteria exist according to which we could decide how suitable or unsuitable given data product actually may be for the type of connectivity related question that we wish to address. And so that's a topic that we hope, or that I hope, we'll be able to focus on more explicitly in the near future, probably by running a bunch of sensitivity analysis, and then maybe, if possible, as well, performing targeted ground-based validations. The question of data requirements is one that may be worth addressing at any scale, really, even small scales, but it is especially important for large regions if we want to make connectivity a useful tool at policy relevant scales. And so I'm going to squeeze in really quickly that sixth and last question that I wanted to bring in today. And this one is about whether the notion of optimal landscape connectivity makes sense and whether it is something that landscape managers should actually aim for. And this is an important question because in some landscapes with great human impact, there's often a need to enhance the connectivity of some materials while at the same time promoting the disconnectivity of other materials. And so if you were to take the example of a landscape like this, ecologists know very well that agricultural expansion can severely affect movements of biota and so severely affect ecological connectivity. So when we are in predominantly agricultural landscapes, there is a need to increase ecological connectivity, and that's why ecological corridors, like the forested corridor that you can see here on the image, that's why corridors like this are established. That said, while there's often a big push to increase ecological connectivity in landscapes like this one, I would argue that in turn, there is a need to promote hydrologic disconnectivity and chemical disconnectivity as well. The idea being to prevent excess water and excess nutrients that are associated with agricultural operations. So prevent those from traveling further downstream. And so what that means is that in human impacted landscapes or multi-purpose landscapes, connectivity trade-offs are needed. And we can evaluate those trade-offs using a three-axis connectivity framework like the one that you have here. Intuitively, because we see connectivity as a natural process, we tend to think that the greater it is, the better. And if we were to maximize it along all three axes, that would put us in the situation that you have here on the diagram with the black X line. But in most landscapes, what we rather need to identify is a range of desirable conditions along all three axes. And that range is not necessarily aligned with the maximum values. So that three-axis framework is often described in theory, but because it truly captures eco-hydrological connectivity, but it's not commonly used in a practical way yet. And so I just wanted to put that question on the agenda, just to underline the fact that if we truly want to have a holistic, multi-material view of landscape connectivity, then we're going to be required to work across disciplines so that we can agree on what would need to be measured and how. So I will start wrapping up here by saying that despite all the unknowns that surround the connectivity concept, especially eco-hydrological connectivity, I still see a lot of promise in it. And so I think that a research agenda articulated around it is warranted. And the reason why I think we need such an agenda is because connectivity underlies a lot of real world water issues. So should it be flood dynamics, droughts, eutrophication, drinking water supply, etc. Hence the references to connectivity in important guiding documents. So, I mean, two guiding documents that I've went through quickly would be the OECD Water Resources Allocation Policy Report from 2015 that makes an explicit reference to connectivity, or the Ontario Great Lakes Strategy document that also makes an explicit reference to connectivity. What is paradoxical is the fact that while we have guiding and policy documents that explicitly reference connectivity, many stakeholders say that, yes, they do have some intuitive knowledge of connectivity, but it is not something that they're using in their day-to-day work. And so my hope is that we can reach a stage where we can identify, I guess, consensus measures or metrics that would allow us to bridge that gap. There is a lot we know from a theoretical standpoint about ecological and hydrological connectivity. Our challenge in hydrology is not about a lack of ideas, it's rather about a lack of consensus. There are also dozens of spatial indices or spatial metrics of structural connectivity that exist in the literature, which is great if we want to start synthesizing them or comparing them. The areas where less progress has been made, though, concern how to effectively measure functional connectivity, how to effectively model it, how to incorporate it into landscape management tools, and how to communicate what we know about it to non-academic partners. And so if we want to be able to do that, that consensus is actually going to be needed, not only in terms of definition and approaches, but also having common language to support discussions, etc. So yeah, I'm just going to wrap up by saying that addressing some of the questions that I was discussing earlier today will help us do that for sure. But I want to reiterate that the questions that I listed are not the only ones that need to be addressed. They're the questions that I'm personally biased towards, and there are definitely others. And so there is space and a need for cross-disciplinary conversation to figure out what a connectivity agenda could and should look like. So I'm going to stop here. Thank you very much for your attention, and I'll be happy to entertain any questions that you might have.
Thanks very much, Genevieve. That was very interesting, and already I see one or two questions coming in. But as I move to them, I just wanted to talk a bit about your gatekeeper concept, which I like. And what if the gatekeeper is in the subsurface? Meaning, I think at the surface level, you can use a high-resolution DEM maybe to understand, if I'm understanding correctly, where you'd see sinks or areas for holding back maybe connectivity. But what if that's in the subsurface linked to, the subsurface flow contributions that you're describing? Any
Yeah.
thoughts on that and how tractable it is to kind of see those gatekeepers that aren't, expressed at the surface in a more overland flow setting?
Yeah, so that's interesting because that's one of the slides that I took out because I was afraid of running out of time. And so I actually feel like the fill and spill conceptualization is probably one of the most striking examples of cascading processes. And basically you could see every single cell in between your depressions as being a gatekeeper, because unless it is active and whatever is happening upslope of it is active as well, you don't have anything happening downslope. And so that would be the same kind of principle. But of course, that would presume that you have subsurface fill and spill everywhere, which you don't. And so in case you don't, I have no clue what theoretically speaking, gatekeepers kind of exist everywhere, but I don't know what type of data we would actually be able to rely on to figure out where they're located. And so again, that kind of goes back always to that data availability issue and how it is that we can implement that. But the gatekeeper idea is not a new one. So in ecology, for example, those correspond to the stepping stone and hub species kind of ideas. So that's the same kind of conceptualization, really.
Okay. Here's a question from Emily. She's read and appreciated your work here on the prairies. Her question is regarding the gatekeeper nodes. Is there a field-based method to identify those gatekeeper nodes that might be helpful to model these relationships? This could be particularly important, as you mentioned, in keeping nutrients in wetlands or on the agricultural landscape rather than impacting downstream water quality.
Yes. So great question. Whether it is possible to be in the field, look at a location and decide whether it is a gatekeeper or not, I would say no, simply because you need to have a broad scale view of your whole network before you can know exactly which elements or which nodes within the network are more important than others. Something that we're doing right now, though, is to figure out how much field data do we actually need in order for identification of gatekeepers to be robust. And so I showed the kind of Grand River example earlier for fallow lands. I have another student right now, Crystal Siebert, who is working on doing that kind of assessment across the whole Lake Erie Basin. I have another member in my group, Kayla, who is trying to do that for combined stormwater sewer systems because the networks are already present, so it's kind of easier in terms of data. And the preliminary results from last week literally are kind of showing that where the gatekeepers are also seem to be aligned with where we have critical issues in terms of road salt applications and salinity in the water as well. But every time we do those kind of exercises, we basically use whichever data we have available. And what I'm hoping we can do in the next few years is figuring out whether there is a minimum amount of field data in particular that we actually need in order for that assessment to be robust. So I guess long story short, I do not have an answer to your question, but I'm interested in it.
Great. Here's a question from Big C. Are there common drivers for connectivity across different disciplines?
That's a good question. I'm hoping there is. It is difficult to figure out though, because we're having terminology issues. So one example I often give when I'm asked a question like this is, I was sitting down, so I had a 2-day workshop with biologists from the EPA and USGS 4 or 5 years ago. And it basically took us a day and a half to figure out what hydrologists call structural connectivity. So figured out that it was completely different from what biologists call structural connectivity. And then once we had resolved all of those issues, then we're actually able to find commonalities. And that happens every single time I discuss connectivity with somebody from another discipline. So I think that there are common points or drivers, but we kind of need to resolve those pesky terminology issues first. But another example would be we published a paper 2 or 3 years ago about using brain connectivity metrics to look at water table connectivity in a catchment. And that worked pretty well. So again, we spent a few months trying to figure out exactly what the brain neuroscientists were talking about and how we could relate that to the small catchments in the Swiss Alps. And once we had that, then we're actually able to reuse their methods and get some interesting results. So yeah, we just need to make the effort, I guess.
Good. Here's a question. Do you think connectivity is additive? Meaning if you go to the larger watershed scale, is it simply the addition of connectedness you might have observed at smaller scales? Or is it a whole different type of connectivity?
So that's a great comment or question. So that's another question for the future that I think would be worth looking at. So in some of the earlier connectivity papers, including some that I wrote myself, we kept writing that connectivity was scale invariant. And if that were true, then what you're suggesting would actually be the case. I don't think that we've done enough connectivity studies across a range of scales to actually answer that. But based on some of the preliminary results that we have, I would say that this is not the case. And if this is not the case, then that makes things even more complicated. But yeah, that's definitely something that we need to focus on a little bit more.
Yeah, Chris Spence and I, along with Karen Harmon and Ilya and Dan Karen, have a little commentary coming out. And it's, like beauty is in the eye of the beholder.
Yeah.
Somehow, maybe connectivity is at the scale of the beholder. And but I agree with you. That's really a fruitful area potentially for discussion and learning. Okay, here's a question. Not sure I fully understand it, but we'll see what you think. What type of programming, R, MATLAB, Python, is utilized to run these models? As far as I'm concerned, GIS remote sensing can be used to visualize such network patterns you presented.
So by models, I'm not quite sure whether we're talking about the agent-based models, the cellular automated models, or the graph theory, kind of the network models. The answer is that there are packages that can be used in almost all of those to investigate that. And so, for example, for the graph theory stuff, there are some bioinformatics toolboxes in MATLAB, for example, that we can use functions from in order not to have to recode everything from scratch. Same thing with the image analysis toolbox, for example. And then for the rest, sometimes I kind of code things on my own. There are some ecological softwares as well that we've been working with and try to trick them into thinking that we're looking at species movement, so animal movement, but in fact, we're looking at water. Sometimes we're successful, sometimes we're not. And yeah, the agent-based and cellular automated models that we've been trying so far have been in MATLAB as well. We're programming them from scratch. So,
I guess percolation theory would
yes,
be in that same kind of group, right? Directed percolation theory, regular percolation theory. One last
and a
question.
lot of the a lot of the connectivity metrics that currently exist are actually based on percolation theory in hydrology.
One last question from Bing. Have you considered direct connectivity and indirect connectivity in ecohydrology? Gatekeeper seems to me like indirect connectivity.
Yes. So we're definitely looking at both. That's a great question. So the notion of direct versus indirect connectivity is something that is present in graph theory and present in ecology as well. We haven't really looked at the distinction in hydrology because we consider all locations to kind of be a transition between whatever the source is and the outlet. But yeah, that's something that's applicable for sure.
Right. Well, Genevieve, we have a couple more questions, but I'm afraid we're out of time. We need to wrap up. And, we're at the top of the hour and move you now to our classroom discussion with the Journal Club. So we will see you there in a couple of minutes. If you need a wellness break in between, that's fine. But on behalf of everybody, thank you so much for a really interesting talk and really, I think, pointing a way for future research in terms of how to get to grips with something so important like connectivity and these strides you've made in terms of linking to how other researchers in other fields have done it. This is really inspiring for so many of us. So thanks very much.
Sounds good. Thank you.
Okay. See you.
Bye.
Thanks again. Bye.